Hello, I'm at Reardon, and thanks for watching this November 1st Wednesday evening West weather update brought to you by Nutrien Ag Solutions. We're looking at here to start. This is the total precipitable water. It's actually a satellite loop looking down on the eastern Pacific. You can see North America here on the kind of top right side of the screen. I want to show this because it shows all the moisture really kind of in the total atmosphere over the eastern Pacific. And I'm showing it to you because there's kind of a curious feature on here. If you watch these videos in January or March of last year, you certainly heard us talk about this. And it's that old friend of ours, the atmospheric rivers. And if you look here north of Hawaii, we actually have now here in November of 2023, an atmospheric river event setting up yet again. Now, I'm not to say this is going to be, the defining feature of this winter. These are something we see every single year in any winter, even some years that end up drier than average. But nonetheless, it's a feature of our water year, and it brings a lot of, predictable rainfall to the Northwest, the Western U.S., and sometimes other regions. We have one here today. It's kind of obvious if you just look at the North Pacific that there is this ribbon of moisture coming up and pushing toward the Northwest, particularly the Pacific Northwest, even starting to kind of push into parts of Oregon and Washington now here this afternoon. There are some other things I think you can look at on this map. It's pretty neat just to watch the loop kind of over and over again. You get some sense of the atmosphere bubbling, twisting, and turning. We obviously have more moisture down here by the equator. The warm air there holds more moisture. It has a higher capacity to hold moisture, and so we see some of the highest moisture values in the atmosphere down there by the equator. And kind of curiously, not relevant right now for the western U.S., we kind of already had our cold shot, but if you look over in the eastern U.S., the southeast coastline, see this dry air punching in over the southeast Gulf Coast. That's that big cold front that pushed through North America here recently, kicking out all that subtropical moisture into parts of Florida and out through the south part of the Gulf here. It's kind of neat to see that cold front push all the way that far to the southeast, representative of how strong that is with freeze warnings, frost advisories, you name it, out for many parts of the southeast right now. But the story out here for the west is certainly this atmospheric river event. And if you look closely at that ribbon of moisture I defined, you kind of see two phases or two lobes to it. There's one here a little bit closer to the western seaboard, and then this one further toward the west. And I think this is going to be, at the very least, kind of a two-parter event. One that's starting really kind of right here now and Wednesday p.m. for parts of the Pacific Northwest. We have another one coming in that's going to affect us, I think, through the weekend and even into early next week here. Now, what's kind of cool, this is just looking at, a derived value on a satellite map. But if we just look at the visible satellite loop right now of the eastern Pacific, you can actually kind of make out where that atmospheric river is over the eastern Pacific and this cloud shield that's pushing in across the northeast Pacific, getting into parts of the Pacific Northwest already where that cloud shield is now overhead, causing cloudy skies. And just looking here recently, we have moderate rainfall observations now being reported in parts of the Pacific Northwest and the Willamette Valley there. Jumping over and looking at the radar mosaic current at the recording of this video, kind of right around lunchtime here on the west coast. There's that rainfall I just talked about moving into parts of Washington and Oregon. That's going to continue, I think, through the evening here and then into tomorrow. This will push off kind of as we go through the night tonight up toward the northeast. I expect eastern Washington, even some parts of the rain shadow there to get some measurable precipitation out of this, and perhaps even parts of northwest Washington and the Golden Triangle. Can't rule out something here in the Snake River Valley as well. The kind of key message here for this video, almost to kind of spoil the whole forecast here, for at least for the 7 days, is that the 7-day forecast, this from the National Weather Service, the Weather Prediction Center, is a lot of rainfall coming for the parts of the Pacific Northwest. That's kind of the big summary here with this atmospheric river event. Expecting pretty heavy rainfall at times in parts of the Willamette Valley, the SeaTac area, certainly the coastal mountain ranges as well, which catch so much of that water. And then even some areas to the east of that. I mentioned the rain shadow here in eastern Washington, expecting even some rain to get into here, certainly far eastern Washington and the Palouse, parts of the Snake River Valley, expecting rainfall to push into some of these areas that typically miss out maybe on some of these events typically, but with so much of this moisture coming in, multiple rounds of it, I do expect some areas in here, including parts of western Montana, to get some measurable precip out of this, and can't rule out some higher amounts here in eastern or southeastern Washington falling at times. The Willamette Valley, as far as we're concerned, likely getting quite a bit of heavy rain here, really starting tonight. I'll go through the whole timing of this here in a second, but when all is said and done, it would not surprise me if we're looking at anywhere from 2 inches in some parts of the valley, and I can't rule out locally an area or municipality exceeding perhaps even 4 inches. Right now, it's kind of over a long window. This is right here looking down a 7-day forecast all the way out till November 8th, early morning on Wednesday. I'm not as concerned for kind of that flash flooding because it's going to be more of a slow burn in terms of that rainfall, not expecting, heavy thunderstorms or anything like that that's going to drop it all at once. But when you consider how wet we've been, Over the last 30 days, the soils are very dry. We have high streams and whatnot. That flooding is still going to be a concern. There's a hydrological outlook out for this area at this time as regards to that. So keeping an eye on that there. Another area I don't want to forget about here is the Sacramento Valley here in Northern California. It's possible we could see some rainfall out of this. I think with the early part of these atmospheric river systems, they're kind of pushing up more from the southwest toward the northeast, and that's kind of leaving some of these areas with lesser precipitation, at least perhaps in these kind of initial rounds of this, which I'll show in just a second here. But I think as we go more into next week, that will open up some of these areas for some more precipitation as the event gets a little less southwest to northeast and more west to east, allowing some of the rainfall to get further interior and into parts of California as well. Just to give some timing on this, I mentioned that cloud shield and the rainfall observations have really already started in parts of the Willamette Valley and western Oregon along the coastline. We can see that here. This is looking at the ECMWF forecast for rainfall and precipitation type amounts going forward. We'll just take this through the whole 7 days here, valid as of Wednesday evening. You can see that rainfall coming down as forecasted here in parts of western Oregon. I'll take this through Wednesday evening tonight. You can see some of that pushing off into eastern Washington. Can't rule out some mixed precipitation here at the higher elevations. That continues to push off into the day tomorrow on Thursday through parts of northern Idaho, perhaps even western Montana. Kind of missing out a little bit here on the Snake River Valley, but certainly getting into eastern Washington. And we have kind of another round coming in for the Willamette Valley and parts of western Oregon midday tomorrow. I'll kind of keep this kind of tonight event and tomorrow as their own kind of first wave. We just looked at that atmospheric river event a little bit further toward the east at the start of this video, and there's a bit of a lull as we go through the day. I think on Thursday as it kind of clears out, getting into Friday morning, but really Friday evening, if you look kind of off to the west coast there, we have the next event really coming in right at the beginning of the weekend here on the Friday PM, where rainfall expecting to start at some point Friday PM overnight, potentially for parts of western Oregon, including the Willamette Valley. Yet again, you're going to hear that probably a few more times as I take you through this forecast here, with rainfall expecting to kind of peak in intensity perhaps throughout the next 7 days. The strongest rainfall might come in that kind of Friday into Saturday early morning time frame. See widespread rainfall now forecast from the ECMWF model here across the Pacific Northwest, including parts of eastern Washington, getting into the upper, or I should say the middle and lower Snake River Valley here, parts of the Willamette Valley continuing to stay under heavy rainfall getting through the early part of Saturday morning, with some of this rainfall now pushing all the way through parts of central Idaho and trying to sneak in with some lighter amounts here in the northwest. We did see with these kind of first two systems leaving most of California out of the rainfall for now, seeing some of this now push in the second event into Northern California, certainly along the coastline here on the northern coast. This is now looking Saturday PM. So this system starts to exit the area as we go into Sunday midday. But again, this is why I said I'm going to sound like a broken record. You look off the west coast of Oregon and Washington, we have yet another low pressure system coming in associated with this Pacific jet extinction, the atmospheric river event. All these things are connected, and yet another round of precipitation likely to move in at some point Sunday night, getting into early Monday. It's kind of, the hits keep coming. You get a lull maybe for 24 hours, and then typically we're seeing that next system come in the forecast here. As we kind of go out, this system coming through next Monday, likely to impact parts of the Pacific Northwest. The details are getting a little bit murkier because now we're into a 5, 6, and 7 day forecast, but expecting more rainfall to come through on Monday for much of the area. And this is the event I said at the beginning of this that I think as we get later into this, whatever you want to call it, the 7 day forecast, we're opening up parts of California to more precipitation, potentially in the elevations here across the northern Sierras, and can't rule out some showers getting into parts of the Sacramento Valley at times. Not expecting anything, particularly heavy, not dissimilar from what we saw earlier in October here, with just some spotty showers trying to push in at times to the Sacramento Valley, something like 1/10 of an inch. Can't rule out something closer to maybe 1/3 or 1/2 of an inch, depending on where exactly you are. That system comes through, and then finally, what's now all the way out into a 7 day forecast, see some of the models trying to push a low pressure system more west to east, and those can be a little bit more impactful for the interior because they're less of a glancing blow. And so we see yet more precipitation trying to push into the Sacramento Valley of California, perhaps some Sierra snow, additional rainfall if this comes through for parts of the Willamette Valley, eastern Oregon, and this one kind of coming through that more west to east trajectory, leaving out some of these northern states from as much precipitation. And as this one wraps up, perhaps some snow in western Montana. Now I have to put a big grain of salt on this forecast here. We're all the way out to Thursday, November 9th of next week. At the beginning of this video, I said it was a November 1st forecast video, so looking at an 8-day forecast here. This final low pressure system coming through, the details on this one aren't clear, but the models are showing kind of the end of the system, something coming through about midday next, or midweek out into next week. So I don't know how many waves were in there, maybe 3 to 4 depending on your exact definition, but certainly about 3 here, with one Wednesday night into tomorrow, another one coming through Friday evening, persisting for much of that northwest area through Saturday. Something of a break Sunday, depending on where you are, with another event coming on shore in Oregon and Washington Sunday night, and then pushing through Monday. And then looking potentially at that colder system coming through more west to east out into Wednesday. Again, the details on that one are less clear, but that one, at least right now, trying to push more into the northern valley of California. Might have to keep an eye on that one as we got into next week. Now, that doesn't sound like great news if you don't like rain. I do have a little bit of good news for the region, the northwest and parts of the west region at large, and that is the temperature conversation will not be as cold as it's been in recent weeks here. So we're looking down at the ECMWF one-day temperature anomalies. The warm colors are warmer than average, the cooler and the bluer colors are colder than average. And this is looking out here now, just going through Wednesday night into tomorrow, and then into Thursday, and then into Friday. And with these systems kind of wrapping up like this, they're trying to pull those warm fronts into the area, which is why just looking down across Saturday into Sunday, really that kind of early weekend forecast, we're pretty much warm across the board across the western U.S. Now, areas that are getting rainfall, have clouds over them, they're not going to feel, like the warmest day, but certainly not going to be talking about big freezes or frosts or anything like that in any of the valleys here. So I think that's good news despite a lot of this rainfall coming. And this is really the story all the way through the entire western region until we get out into next week, where I mentioned that west to east system trying to get that cold front into the area might try to bring the temperatures down. We've seen that trend here of late, which is why if I take this all the way out into Thursday, now into Friday of next week, again, an 8-day forecast, we're starting to see those colder temperatures build back into the area. It doesn't look great here. Nothing here screams, big frost or freeze event right now. But we wouldn't have many details on that anyway, 7 to 9 days out, just not seeing that signal right now. But possibly looking at a cool down from what should be a pretty warm 7-day forecast at this point. At the end of it, that's 7 to 8 day, Wednesday to Thursday, November 8th of next week. Now looking out beyond that, I've kind of sounded like a broken record over the last 2 weeks. I've expected this pattern to persist, where we're continuing to watch an active period of precipitation move into parts of the west region, largely due to the MJO just kind of parking itself over the eastern Pacific and the western hemisphere, and it has at times kind of looped around the eastern Pacific, which has brought that inclement weather right back to us. If we look out into the long-range jet stream forecast, I'll make this valid right at, let's say, Friday, November 10th. So it's looking all the way out into next week, peering into the crystal ball here. What we see here is a Pacific jet coming down, trying to move into a trough here. That color is not the most obvious on the screen, but that Pacific trough down here pushing into the area. We see the subtropical jet a little bit further to the south. To me, at least kind of initially, this looks somewhat similar to what we've seen kind of over the last 30 days or so, where we have nice southwesterly flow pushing up into the area, likely keeping parts of the western U.S. a little bit wetter. All things considered, at the end of next week, we do see kind of a weak ridge here over parts of British Columbia, maybe even Washington, which might try to push temperatures up a little bit in parts of the Pacific Northwest. But really such a deep trough like this, likely bringing cooler temperatures into the south of that to parts of California and Nevada, which is why you heard me say in that kind of 7 to 9 day window, we might be cooling back down again as we get out into the end of next week. Seeing the reason for that here in the ECMWF ensemble forecast at the end of next week. So that might be the forecast going forward there for next weekend, a little bit cooler than average, which perhaps some more rainfall and systems to talk about. And I think the reason for that, if I zoom this in a little bit, looking at a forecast of the Madden-Julian oscillation, what we sometimes call the MJO, it has really kind of been parked in these kind of black lines here in October over here in the Western Hemisphere, at least the Western Pacific. And I think I mentioned last week, there was kind of a fork in the road where if it went across the Indian Ocean and kind of reset over in the Eastern Hemisphere, that would likely give us a break in what has been a very active and wet season here for the Pacific Northwest to start fall. But there was this other option, and we were kind of leaning this way that it might try to do one of these, for lack of a better word, loop-de-loops back through the Western Pacific and then pushing into the Western Hemisphere again, moving west to east. If it does this, this is typically a signal for more active inclement weather across the Western U.S., more rainfall, more cold fronts. And because that's the forecast now moving into November, it wouldn't shock me if going into November we stay wet across parts of the Western U.S. There's more troughs to talk about, more rainfall, and less drought concern. So that is still the forecast here, with the models coming into a better agreement of it moving back through the Western Pacific, which is what we watch for some of these storm systems to come through the Western U.S. Look at the Climate Prediction Center, their forecast for the 6 to 10 day outlook. This is kind of getting into the end of next week. I think they're kind of eyeing that more southerly system we talked about moving from the west to east, which would bring that rainfall to parts of Northern California, parts of Southern Oregon, parts of the Snake River Valley, bringing temperatures down in here on the way while they do that. If you remember, I mentioned there was that kind of weak ridging in the ECMWF ensemble model over parts of Washington and Oregon. Could see perhaps a temperature warm up at some point for that area at the end of next week, while some of these other areas stay a little bit cooler underneath precipitation. If we jump to the 8 to 14 day outlook, you'll see that the Climate Prediction Center still has this wetter contour across the western region, a little bit of a warmer contour for parts of the Pacific Northwest. I don't totally disagree with this because we saw that MJO trying to push back through the Western Pacific, through the Eastern Pacific into the Western Hemisphere. That typically is a more active signal for the Western U.S. What I have less confidence here is the temperature conversation. This kind of wetter 7-day forecast is a kind of on the warm side. We just talked about those temperature anomalies. We have seen in October some of these systems come through where they drop rainfall and then snow in the Sierras, and they're quite a bit colder. And then the backside of them, they have a big cold front. We're talking about freeze watches, freeze warnings, and frost. It's not clear to me as we get out into early November here if these systems, as far as the more active ones are concerned, are going to be these warmer events that we see in the 7-day forecast, or if we're going to be on the colder side. So that's something I'm curious to see as we go through that kind of first and then second week of November. Just to get another opinion, I showed the ECMWF ensemble jet stream forecast just a second ago, showing you that trough over parts of the western U.S. This is the GFS ensemble model, so looking at the American model to get a different opinion here. And just for the sake of consistency, I'll move that back to Friday, November 10th here. And you see similar forecasts. They're less strong of a subtropical jet, but we have that trough with that southwesterly flow pushing into parts of Northern California, parts of Oregon, likely to keep a more active period, at least in terms of precipitation for parts of the western region, with a particular focus on this area here. Not a surprise that the Climate Prediction Center drew a very similar contour in that 6 to 10 day outlook. And if I take this forecast forward, we see that trough starting to push in over the interior west. This forecast now all the way out to Sunday of next weekend, so can't put too much faith in this, but this would be a little bit of a cooler pattern here, certainly for the interior west than not here. But again, looking at this far, hard to say for certain what kind of weather we're going to have with any certainty. Looking at longer range, I did want to update you all. We have a new Climate Prediction Center forecast. This is the monthly outlook now for November from the CPC. This one comes with a little bit of a grain of salt, so this will start November 1st. It's November 1st today. We see this big wet contour over the Pacific Northwest. Well, the 7-day forecast that I just showed you, extremely wet for parts of the Willamette Valley, potentially 2 to 4 inches. Parts of eastern Washington look pretty wet as well. That 7-day forecast is November 1st right through November 8th, and that includes November. So their outlook is kind of the rainfall that we're pretty certain about coming through for the next 7 days is kind of baked into this forecast a little bit. So this isn't to say this area is going to remain wet for the rest of November. I can't say that's not going to be the case, but you have to consider that we do include that first week, that first 7-day forecast, in the entire monthly outlook here. So I think that's why this area has such a bullseye over it. Kind of curiously, they're on the warmer side for parts of the western region here for the month of November. I mentioned I'm a little bit unsure about that going through the middle and end of November. Again, it's possible with some of these wetter systems, even with a march through the MJO where we're forecasting it, that some of the cold fronts on the backside bring those frost freeze and warnings and advisories back into the conversation. So can't say too much certain about that. Not as confident in the temperature conversation as we go through November here to end the month. And then to get another opinion here, we looked at the Climate Prediction Center forecast for November. This is looking at the ECMWF Weekly's forecast model here, and this is actually pushed this out from November 15th to December 15th. So you can think of it as kind of a monthly forecast, that 30-day forecast, but starting in the middle of November and looking out to December. And I did that because I didn't want that kind of 7-day forecast bias in there that we were just looking at in the forecast before. I'm asking the model, what do we think, what kind of signal are we seeing kind of in November and going into the beginning of December? And kind of curiously, that's not totally what I didn't expect, but we actually see a shift drier here from the ECMWF and parts of the Pacific Northwest. If anything, a little bit shift wetter toward the south. We've kind of talked about how that's more of a typical or textbook El Niño pattern, but it's curious to see the ECMWF Weekly shift toward that as we go through November here into early December. This weekly model is not perfect. It's far from perfect. If these long-range models, were very good, we would use them far more, but sometimes they pick up on signals pretty early, and that's why we still look at them and show them at times. And I will say this fall, for parts of the Western U.S., the ECMWF Weeklies I've not done a poor job picking up on some of those pattern signals. So this is definitely something I'm keeping in the back of my mind, that as we get through this kind of wet fall here for the Pacific Northwest, is it possible that El Nino takes over here as we get through November into early December, into those winter months proper? If that were to happen, we might be seeing the first signals here from the ECMWF with a much more kind of typical or textbook El Nino pattern. Weather to the south, much drier for the Pacific Northwest, kind of indicative potentially of that split flow that I was talking about earlier. And I say that because if we look down on those sea surface temperature anomalies across the Pacific, we've showed this at different times throughout the year, and it's not always obvious, that El Nino is the biggest driver. But if you just look at this map, the El Nino, which is this warm water here in the Central Pacific, this kind of signature here, is, I would argue, now maybe the most obvious thing that jumps off this map when you first look at it. We have some warm water here across the east of Japan and the Western Pacific. We still have this lingering warmth here in the Atlantic, which has helped to produce hurricanes at times this year in the Atlantic Ocean. But this water warming up here in the Central Pacific, that's our El Nino. And as this strengthens and becomes the most dominant feature here, that's likely to increase the chance of a more textbook El Nino winter. So we're keeping an eye on this here as it kind of strengthens, expecting it at some point this winter to take hold and deliver that more kind of textbook wetter south, drier north signature. In fact, if we go over and look at the El Nino index, which measures the water temperatures, departures from normal in that Central Pacific, we mentioned it's been a very slow growth this year toward a moderate to strong El Nino. And just in the last few weeks here, you've kind of noticed an uptick in that El Nino strength, at least since the end of October here, getting into the turn of the month. So perhaps seeing kind of a re-strengthening of El Nino going forward into November. Is that kind of what the ECMWF is picking up on, where they're trying to switch that pattern around, where we shift drier to the Pacific Northwest, wetter down further south toward California proper, and parts of Arizona and Nevada as we go into December? I can't rule that out. That's certainly a possibility given El Nino strengthening here if that were to continue. We do expect El Nino to peak at some point here in December or January. If it's going to do that, we'd likely expect strengthening into that. So that story is kind of lining up here. This is one I'm going to be watching closely, hoping to get some more insight for you all at the end of next week into what we might be seeing in December with some new forecasts coming out on the 5th of the month here in just a few days. I think that's all I have for you all this evening. Thank you for watching,